Hello, and welcome back to Bearing Birth, a birth story podcast highlighting the emotional impact of birth, the immediate postpartum period, and the years beyond. I'm Sophie, a perinatal mental health therapist.
And I'm Jordan, a doula specializing in postpartum support. Today, we are sharing part 2 of our conversation with Rashida Quinn. Rashida is the program director of ABNOW, which stands for the Alliance of Black Nurses Association of Oregon. She is also the host of 2 podcasts called Black Care Matters and Dark Matters, both linked in our description below. Rashida is also a former doula, poet, and outspoken advocate for restorative justice.
In our last episode, Rashida shared with us her pregnancy, labor, and birth experiences with both of her daughters. In today's episode, Rashida walks us through what it's been like navigating postpartum as an interracial couple, making difficult decisions in order to preserve the well-being of her young family.
This was such a valuable and important conversation, and we're grateful for Rashida's ability to articulate the Black experience, especially in the context of a country where racism is intricately woven into all institutions and systems, and especially the healthcare system.
We've added the resources mentioned by Rashida in this episode in the description below, and we've also included several support groups, both local and nationally, for BIPOC mothers and birthing people.
We hope you take something meaningful from this thoughtful conversation, and a huge thank you to Rashida for chatting with us and sharing your birth and postpartum experiences.
Enjoy part 2 with Rashida.
A doula and a therapist are sitting down to talk about birth. A doula and a therapist are sitting down to talk about birth.
Yeah, postpartum, for the most part, with just your partner, without the family dynamic kind of surrounding you ongoing, was and still is a big challenge. I also lost my best friend suddenly when my baby was like just about to be 3 months. And so
Recently.
the first birth, Zaharia, yeah. So his death very much coincided with my postpartum, and they were in the world for like 2 months at the same time, but they never met.
That's a lot of emotions to navigate.
Yeah, that was a huge element. And then a few months after that, my husband's family and I and him had a huge conflict that left us unable to have them in our lives either. So it was like, yeah, Derek died, and then the grandparents are no longer involved, and it really became sort of all hands on deck, where we were both orienting ourselves to each other in a way that was like we needed more from each other than we ever had in our relationship to do what we were doing, and needed each other to also be very responsible for our individual needs, and both had therapists to support us. So it was harrowing, and we learned, it's kind of like trauma bonding in a way. It's you're having so many experiences of loss and elation.
And with the hormones too that you're going through, it's all amplified.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot to manage. It feels so unfair for like real life struggles to happen when you're like, I'm just like surviving this period of my life. Like, it's
that birth doesn't stop anything.
And for, family ideally is there to help and support. And then when they're still around, right, but not showing up.
Right.
There must just be so much rage that comes with that situation.
Totally.
Jules has shared just a little bit on a walk once, and
Yes, I appreciate that word, rage. Yes, navigating that and just staying grounded to be a new mom has been such a mix of difficulty that you could never imagine would come along with what it means to have your first baby. Can't be prepared for that.
Yeah. Rage comes up for a lot of new parents, and I feel like people don't talk about that. You're supposed to love it, and like, yes, it's hard, but like, don't complain. But like, that's such a confusing emotion if you're not expecting it. And it can come with just postpartum, not even like dealing with other outside stressors or traumas.
Yeah.
Racism.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like the layer that you were talking about at the beginning with your experience is so different from mine, where I don't have to think about, I need to make sure that the people on my care team have the same skin color that I do so that I feel some safety. And then like afterwards, you're dealing with that too in the extended family
Right.
situation. We don't have to keep that part in if you don't want to. It's up to
Yeah.
you.
It's interesting thinking about that, like what to share, what not to share. That in and of itself is one of the most complicated ways I think racism takes up space in your being, is that you have to live with it no matter what. And then there's ways that it's like, I think being a victim of any oppression comes with, how do I navigate the fact that my society would prefer I'm silent about that? How do I navigate the fact that these are also like people biologically related to my children, and preserve any sort of possibility of change without limiting what I need to navigate the detriment of it all? Like, that has been a complete, emotional gymnastics that came with motherhood that I was not signing up for, and has been forced on me, and is a huge part of like what we have had to navigate in parenting, and having to keep demanding that our safety be considered a priority with the grandparents who are supposed to be helpful. It's forced us into a type of parenting that we didn't, an aspect of it that we just didn't expect. It's like learning that your partner's abusive, or like that there's some danger that you have to navigate on top of just acclimating to keeping a small human alive and making sure they have their basic needs met. That there was this other need that we had to make decisions about, and still have to make decisions about, and we don't have a lot of control over it. And it kind of, so that's been a particular part of our struggle.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so much weight on you, so much that you
Shouldn't have, you didn't sign up for this.
Yeah.
and it's like when you and your partner are the only ones like having to take control of the situation.
Right.
Like, it puts so much on you. Like, it would be nice if there was like, I don't know, that's so hard. It's like a smaller version of like Black people in general, like having to take on everything to like inform people and like make sure they feel safe. It's just like, and then that's like miniaturized into individual families as well when you're in interracial families. It's
that really difficult, like emotional labor that is overwhelming, but very much required just to navigate the reality is hard to describe, but so all consuming in a lot of ways, at least that first year of trauma where you're in shock and it's like, oh my God, is this really happening? Like, this is such a long story of creating narratives about Black people and interracial families that suppress or oppress them. And to have it happening to you feels like you're part of this long lineage, and also in the very personalized reality of like, what does this mean for my day to day, or
The
relationship of my child to you, and me to you, and me to my child. And
yeah, it's like there's so many other new parts of you to work. It's like not just your own experience now.
Yeah.
Now
You're
carrying your own experience. You're carrying the experience of your children, advocating for all three of you. That's so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you can't, like, I imagine sometimes like the healthiest thing to do or the most protective thing to do is to just cut off. But then you cut off a relationship for kids who, there's a lot of nuance in there.
It's so much
Just loss.
Yeah, I've had such a huge gift in my therapist, and a lot of the questions and ways we've constantly rolled this thing around throughout the years has been super helpful. But hearing her talk about the emotional harm that interracial children incur when they're given the perspective of anything about their non-whiteness being not a benefit to them, or just there's a huge spectrum of the subtleties of how that messaging gets across to children, or the not so subtleties. But no matter where it lands on how it was given, it has such a massive impact. I think that helped Brendan and I be very anchored in our mode of parenting around protecting their understanding of self as they develop an experience that we both won't have as biracial people, being 100% both and not half one or the other, and letting them have space to integrate all of that. And as a white man, one thing that he's constantly said about his own boundaries with his parents has been that in this white supremacist society where that messaging is baked into the air we breathe, and that you can't protect them from that reality, especially in a monocultural city.
But then to have to protect children from that in your very own family.
That is where he's like, if I can't do it in the world as their white father, I can't allow it from my parents. That's where
you have that control.
Right. And so his being so adamant about that has actually kind of, I have my own process, but his is different. And we've allowed each other to let the processes look different. Those are his actual parents. And we are going to have different reactions to what's happening to us based on our relationship to them. But that being his due north about the situation very much releases me from having to be the one constantly advocating or deciding, that he really absorbs that work with his values as a parent, and I can support him in navigating that. We align in those ways, but it's nice that it's not just my needs, it is his need.
I feel like that's incredible that you have that in your partner. I mean, to have someone who can take some of that from off of your shoulders, that's huge.
Yeah.
It's how partnership should be, I think. Yeah.
It's everything. He is incredible and the first time I met him, we talked about Asada Shakur, and I was like, what's your name again? I just was like, I have never met a white boy in Portland who wants to talk about African revolutionary politics. And so his relationship to dismantling white supremacy for himself and his community and commitment to anti-racism had nothing to do with meeting me, and having his politics fully developed without our relationship being what ignites that drive in him has made living together in our reality as an interracial couple so much more balanced. And
you didn't have to do the work for him.
Right. And I think it's very confusing for for people looking in. The assumption is that it's
doing it out of love
for me and my boundary, or my always on the person experiencing harm, but it's a harm to him, and it's a harm to his reality and his own value system. And I think that really sits at the crux of a lot of what it means to untangle racism in America, is that the narrative is that it's the onus of the person being harmed to also navigate how not to be and pursue justice. And the truth is that there's much trauma in the oppressor that needs to be pursued in terms of how do I do better, or divorce from this system that has infiltrated all of me and I didn't even know, or that work. That shift in perspective of whose work it is could be, is kind of where I place hope when I think about restorative justice. And so to see that unfold in someone without me being the drive is so comforting.
Yeah. What sorts of thoughts went through your mind? I'm just curious about coming on to our podcast as two white people, because I definitely had thoughts about, I don't think I've ever like sat down and like had a conversation about racism with a Black person before. And I was nervous. And listening to your episodes too, I was a little like, oh, I don't know. Like I find myself wanting to not say anything at all out of fear of saying the wrong thing, you know? But that creates such a barrier and just the connection that could be there. And yeah. Did you have any thoughts about?
Well, you never know like what someone's experience is. And as I'm describing Brendan, I could, seeing him, assume the same for him, but met him and found out that he has a huge relationship to Black community. So anytime I feel like I'm sharing or interacting in a white space, there is a huge margin of reality that I don't know about until we're in conversation. And I feel that my perspective and my work and politics and support system has grown to strengthen my ability of communicating exactly what's happening in the sphere of racism much more clearly, that I'm not encumbered by what someone does or does not know about that reality. So it is a little less difficult for me to kind of cut through and continue to orient myself to what I know and not sort of be gaslit by what people don't know, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you don't want to tiptoe around it.
Right.
You can't.
Yeah,
I don't
and I can't.
That.
And so it's more, I think, yeah, like hearing that you felt nervous or that you don't know what the right thing is to say, or that feeling, I think is just really like the vulnerability of acknowledging that, I think is another element of what makes difficult conversations possible. Because, like in the instance with his family, I think there's a lot of either like freeze and stonewall if you don't know what to say, because whiteness has a story about always being right. And if you're not the smartest person in the room, then there's something wrong, especially if Black people are around. So these motifs that exist in society are really easy to lean into if you're not doing any work to know them or dismantle them. And so I think that it's super common to allow that feeling to make it, to become a barrier, like you said, but
not
really
even taking the risk to have a conversation.
Right. Yeah. And then once there's an unfolding, then there's a space to sort of acknowledge more about what's okay and what's not, you know, as opposed to trying to tiptoe and then wind up in a space that's super harmful. And this is making me think of one of the things that I think is so helpful that we talk about now as we are constantly, you know, survivors of this circumstance of abandonment, that having there be a culture of anti-racist values in your life, whether you're around Black people or not, makes any sort of misstep much more manageable, because it's not the first time that you've engaged with the subject matter or thought about it. And so that's something that we really believe in, and is sort of the point at which we feel like reconciliation is possible. And when somebody is, you know, willing to take on the work of creating those values as a part of their personal needs, and not just in response to when something happens that's harmful. So it's not reactive.
Not reacting.
Yeah. And it is just something we know about, like how to care for this special circumstance. People teach themselves how to do that about so many different things, but with race, it's so much more difficult to invest. And a large part of that is that it's privileged, right? Like there's a lot of rewards associated with not doing that work, and a lot of peace that comes with just not having to think about it. So to actively disrupt that for yourself is it can be daunting and a space of denial, and, you know, a lot can come to make it harder to get help.
Yeah.
And yet that's so small in comparison to the everyday.
The experience of racism.
Yeah. Yeah,
exactly.
it's so small.
Right.
Yeah.
Have that conversation a lot, that this is all resting on this ability for white folks to tolerate
being uncomfortable,
being the uncomfortable, and that that's not even the full
it's like just an
experience of racism. Right.
Yeah.
How wild and how thorough of a system.
Oh my gosh. So thorough. It's just like, yeah, I think especially like working in the birth world, it feels especially important with the mortality rates of Black women. And I've been in the birth world for years now and like haven't even had much of that experience because we live in Portland. And I feel like I'm so appreciative of this conversation. And like, I'm really looking forward to listening to your podcast and hearing the stories of the nurses in Portland, because it just feels, it's inspiring that for the Black people that live here and work here, and especially in a role like you talked about in the hospital system, where that's just like such a clear problem. Like that system is so broken. It's just inspiring to hear that these stories are being spread. I mean, I have some friends who just like would never choose to live here because it's just too much work to be a Black person in a city like this. And I feel like it's so good that like there are still Black people living here. And
what makes you want to stay here even if you have to navigate all of this?
That's a good question. We talk about leaving all the time. All the time. And we're still not convinced that it's the forever. It's, I think anybody who ends up in the Pacific Northwest, there's a lot of special things about being here that feel like we should all have access to, like the rivers and the trees and the,
ocean and mountains,
the things that we love. And so I want to be here the same reason that a lot of people do. And also I think about my kids growing up here and not having enough people who look like them. And so it's a constant negotiation of what's affordable, what's not, like all the same things with racism. And then, there has been a huge turnover in my white friendships over the almost 20 years since I've been in Portland. And so that is also a common denominator of who in my community has the capacity to keep this work as a forefront of their own world, making the long-term ability to stay connected possible. So I don't know if it is where we are right here and right now. And also its sustainability is always kind of a question mark.
And then it's also like, if you do go and there's an exodus of every person of color, a Black person here, then it's like, what is that?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then it's so much pressure on the people who do live here to make it better.
Yeah. There's lots of layers.
Yeah. I imagine it's also like a certain kind of rage comes up for you that to come on the podcast here, you can't just share your birth story.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's everything, it's everything, not just birth. And I also am keenly aware of how silence and silencing is such a forefront of how the system exists. And in that, and being very counter to silence is a way that I orient myself in my work and my desire to share. So knowing that so many ancestors of mine did not have the option to speak truth about their reality makes it more enticing to want to say what's happening, to continue the lineage of that healing. Yeah, because silence can be so deadly and so aggressive. So there's a breaking of that I think is really valuable. And it also, I guess, makes me curious about, we were talking about the nervousness or the ways in which it's common to not want to say the wrong thing when it comes to talking about race in interracial or intersectional situations. And also the ways that shame creates a barrier to honesty, that it feels so bad to acknowledge that these parts of someone exists, that holds denial in place in a very specific way. And that can be really difficult. So I feel like whenever there's any space that's not the dynamic, it's easier to be real with that challenge. And lots of people have different challenges. And then we can talk about the intersectional spaces in which we are all trying to release ourselves from some construct of, so it makes it more approachable.
Yeah. We have a lot more in common than we do that's different. Yeah. Is there anything that I've asked this to a couple of the most recent guests, if you're listening back to this as, this is like a record of you in this moment talking about the different topics we have 10 years from now, 20 years from now, you listen back and you would want to send a message to yourself. Is there anything that you'd want your future self to know about this period of your life?
Gosh, it's such a whirlwind every day.
Or even just 5 years from now when your two kids are maybe in school.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even a year from now, so much happens.
Yeah. I guess I'm really impacted right now by the ways that my spiritual practice and my partnership with Brendan have shown up to support this huge challenge of integrating into a mom of two. And I feel like that would always be something to look back on if I need to remember, like, how did I do it? It's like, oh, the altar work and the communication and the facing hard things and the trusting each other and the relationship building and the honesty and the communication and the elements and the nature, like that we really drew upon all of the spaces between us and bigger than us to make it. So that seems helpful if things get
a reminder
wacky in the future, that I can listen back and be like,
there's my touchstone.
Yeah.
Tell us about your spiritual practice. What does that look like for you?
I feel like it's really broad, and I use on a more daily kind of way my altar space and the tarot as a space of sort of spiritual communication. And I feel like I take a lot of, to me, religions are ways of communicating with divinity. And so there's a lot to learn from a lot of different spaces where people are intentionally doing that. And I'm a poet as well. So I feel like I draw a lot from language. And so, yeah, it's as expansive as something as abstract as spiritual divinity is, and also very like localized in prayer work and altar work and presence and divination tools.
Have you written any poetry recently? What is your poetry about?
Lots of things. Love and Blackness, probably most often. And I haven't been writing a lot. I feel like the babies are the big creative project.
It's a big project. Takes it
over
all out
the
of
last couple of years. And my work as a communication specialist and working with getting messaging about programming, that writing has become the forum has changed, and
like where you channel that creative energy.
Right. Yeah.
I find that to be similar with other creative people I know. And I feel like a lot of people that like fall out of their like chosen creative passions for a while, like you haven't like stopped being creative. It's like you're using that in the other areas of your life.
Yeah.
And I think that's still special. Like it can feel sad, I guess, if you have something you're passionate about that you don't have time for because all of your creativity is being used for like day-to-day stuff.
Right.
But I still think that it can be really beautiful and like bring something special to, I mean, obviously raising children is really important and so endeavor. Creative.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it brings, being a creative person, like brings something special into everything that you do.
Yeah, I agree.
So at the end of every episode, we ask our guests 2 questions. And the first one is, what advice would you give to someone who is about to give birth?
I think the word presence keeps coming up in my mind right now, that the more with the moment you're in you can be, the more like water you can be with it, like flow with what's happening. I feel like when I got really ahead of what's going to happen, how long is this going to take? When I started like future tripping, I was brought out of coping in a way that made it more overwhelming. So anchoring to the moment was, and your people is, I think, what comes up.
I like the image of being like water. Like you said earlier, you can't get off the roller coaster. Like you have to ride through it. And I feel like imagining yourself like water, going with the flow, not overthinking it. I think that's a good image.
It's hard to do in the moment.
It's so hard. I mean, because being with the moment is also being with the extreme. So it's like feeling that 100% is you want to pull off, you know?
It's scary.
Yeah.
There's fear. Other stuff comes up. Yeah. It sounds like you and your partner really lean into all of the whole spectrum of life.
Yeah, I feel in talking about this more so aware of that in this moment too. Yeah, we're very like, what's going on here? What do we think about it? Let's not let anything fester under the surface.
That's really healthy. So our last question is, what is something that makes you laugh about being a parent, your birth experiences? If there's anything in the birth or the pregnancy, I know you said it was pretty challenging, or something that your kids do.
Yeah, gosh. So many little things, I'm sure. And then it's like at this moment, what makes me laugh? Lately, Zaharia has, I think there's some like kid music video that she's seen on YouTube where the parent calls the child sweetie. And I don't think either of us use that word, but she calls us sweetie all the time. And
that's so cute.
It's usually kind of in moments where she's trying to get her way. And then she says it, and Brendan keeps saying like, why does she turn into an alien when she says it? Because she'll be like, I don't want to eat that now, sweetie. And like, it comes out, sweetie. It's like very bizarre.
That is really funny.
And yeah, the moments that she chooses to call us sweetie is like really cracking us up lately. So yeah.
That reminds me of Ruby. She's almost 2 in December. She's starting to say, oh yeah, baby. Or, oh honey. Yeah. In this very exaggerated way.
Yeah.
And it's just so cute. Yeah.
Oh, just like, I heard this. Let me try.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Oh, I feel like you wouldn't survive being a parent, like if you didn't have those cute, funny, like that's why toddlers are hilarious and adorable. It like gets you through every day.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh. That's all the questions that we have. Let me think if there's anything else. Anything you want to?
No,
final
this has
thoughts?
been great. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah.
And
thanks for coming on. Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice to be asked about these things and kind of grounding for me too.
Had you shared your birth stories with anybody in this way?
Publicly?
Like not on a podcast or anything, but did you find people were interested in hearing what?
Yeah, I feel like I talked about my birth, to friends and family, and sharing has been a part of the experience for sure.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so
very
much
much
for sharing
Rashida.
with us.
Yeah. Bearing Birth is available on all major podcast streaming services. We invite you to subscribe as well as follow us on Instagram at Bearing Birth Podcast.